When we look at successful businesses, most of them have one common theme, and that is incredible culture within that business. When we look at Apple, for an example, or Facebook, they all have incredible cultures built by incredible managers and leaders. But how do you instill a great culture within your business? Well, that is where David comes in. David Potter, our next guest, holds an MBA and a PhD specialising in cultural change within companies or organizations. He is the person that is sent to these companies in order to sort out their culture and push them to the next level. He founded and established the Cultural Change Organization, which can be found in the link below, wherever you are watching this or listening to this. And he also has 25 years experience in senior management. He talks a lot about conscious leadership and how you can become more conscious as a leader and help people follow you to that next level. This is the Into the Mind podcast, and my name is Harrison Brown. If you're watching or listening, I hope this helps. David, thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, I think that the way that we sort of connected and the glowing results that my sister gave you when you were teaching her they speak volumes. And the way that my sister said that you were able to engage the whole class when giving lectures is really absolutely incredible. And it's a skill that people are kind of losing nowadays, I think. And I think it might be due to social media, lack of interaction, but whatever it is, you're here and you can help get that back. So where did this begin for you, and how did you get into leadership and cultural change?
Wow. Well, first of all, it's really nice to be here with yourself, Harrison. As far as your sister's concerned, I'd just like to revisit that lovely introduction. She was one of my students on a course called The Art of Influencing, which is delivered by Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow, and they asked me to come in and deliver the course. And it's a course that historically had been delivered in the past, and then they brought it back up again. I think the key thing when it comes to giving lectures is not to give a lecture, right? Is that for me, my philosophy is, okay, this is a lovely opportunity for me to build rapport with these students, right? And to build a kind of dialogue with them. And dialogue being kind of like the art of thinking together, right? So that we're all in this space for 2 hours together, engaging with each other intellectually to try and get some sort of practical accomplishment from that process. Where did it all begin? I think it began when I was about 6 years of age, right? And I wasn't very good at primary school. I kept getting into trouble, right? A bit of an attention seeker. But the one thing I was very good at is I was very good at reading stories from books. So the teacher used to say, would somebody like to stand up and recite a couple of paragraphs from this book? And I would say, can I do it, right? Because it was a bit of a show off, right? But actually, I learned that I enjoyed speaking and I enjoyed communicating. I ended up going into the hospitality business when I left school, and you'll know from the hospitality business that a big part of that is building and maintaining rapport with customers. And I worked in the service side of the hospitality business. So I worked in management, first of all, getting involved in running restaurants, and then moving into large-scale hospitality event companies. In Glasgow, places that you'll recognise, such as the Glasgow Royal Concert Hall, etc. And I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated, about the way that some managers enabled what we call leadership in such a manner that people performed their jobs to a very, very high standard and to a very, very consistent standard. Whereas, unfortunately, there were other examples where that didn't seem to happen, right? Where the men and women in certain other managers' teams, they seemed to be connected at some kind of level, but there was something getting in the way of them being their very best version of themselves, for their teams, and for their organisations. So, cut a long story short, I got an opportunity to do an MBA at Strathclyde University. Loved it. And the one elective on the course that really got my attention was leading cultural change, managing culture. So I signed up for a PhD, went 5 years doing a part-time PhD while simultaneously working in management, right? And in my PhD, I was fascinated by the way in which corporate management teams, through time, create a form of groupthink or corporate culture that either enables the success of that organisation or in some cases can hinder the success of that organisation. So I got into all that. Coming out the end of that, I got to around about my mid-40s, and the one area that I felt was still missing in terms of my knowledge base was what we call the black box. And the black box is basically that depository of ideas that explains the way in which human beings cultivate and develop what we call their intra-personnel skills and their interpersonnel skills. The former being how David gets on with David, right? How I manage my internal identity, my beliefs, my values, my emotional states, my behavioural choices. And then, of course, how that leaks out and influences my interpersonnel skills, the way in which I interpersonally engage with Harrison and with Harrison's team, and how that then generates social results, right? And so I went on another period of study, and I got involved in the world of coaching, studying coaching, also studying in Glasgow with exceptional trainers who introduced me to the world of neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP. And then I decided to go to America, and I studied with world-class trainers again at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who were operating a training business out of the university campus. And they introduced me to the training aspects of what we call NLP, but at a much more advanced level. And then I completed that with a diploma in coaching and mentoring, set up the Cultural Change Company as a provider of leadership training and soft skills development training. And that's kind of how it started, and that's where we are now.
That is fascinating. So you've had a really long career so far, a really successful career so far. How would you, if you were to walk into a business tomorrow, how would you instill that positive culture to begin with?
In terms as a consultant trainer?
Yeah.
If I was to come to your business, for example?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would want to try and understand what it is you think needs to be changed.
So let's say, for an example, you've got a toxic work culture. Let's say that you've got a toxic work culture, and 20% of the team are doing 80% of the work.
Okay.
They're all very good friends. However, maybe some of them can't have those tough conversations in order to say, listen, we're doing most of the work. You need to, come on, get motivated here.
Yeah. So you're into the world of psychological safety there, right? And you're into the world of team members being able to share their experiences in a way that is not threatening to their sense of self, right? Or there's no fear that they're going to be punished or they're going to be victimized. So the key thing in that set of dynamics is to say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how psychologically safe do the people in this organisation feel about speaking up and about giving voice to power and about expressing their concerns? So you would have to do some research into that to tie that down. Yeah.
So you think that feeling psychologically unsafe, impacts your voice within that whatever the work culture might be?
Yeah, well, a lack of psychological safety acts as a catalyst for reinforcing and maintaining the toxic culture, basically. Right.
Okay.
So as long as that's there, lack of, then the toxic culture will flourish. If we look at, there's been a lot of media attention obviously given to organisations in the media, right, where things haven't been working, and psychologically safety or lack of is consistently getting cited as a major problem. The issue is trying to get a handle on exactly what psychological safety is and what it's not, and how to create it, how to recognise it when it's not there, and how to recognise it when it is there. But the main thing is to remember in the organisation, Harrison, is that a lack of psychological safety is a product of a lack of leadership.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm trying to get my head around that one. So if a manager was to come to you for coaching and say that they had an issue with a member of the team that is beginning to become disengaged, shall we say, how would you re-engage that member of the team?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it? Right. So are we talking about so there's one person in a team of how many?
Let's say 5 people.
5 people.
Yeah.
How would you deal with that? I think you have to have dialogue between yourself and that individual. There has to be an openness and a transparency of dialogue. But for that to happen, you have to understand why that person is disengaged. Because disengaged it's an interesting subject, right? Because we have a research instrument called the SEAS assessment, which basically means Staff Engagement Assessment Survey, right? Where we measure engagement on multiple levels. So is the individual disengaged with their task, their job? Or are they disengaged with their colleagues? Or are they disengaged with their line manager? Or are they disengaged with the mission or the vision or the ambition of the business? Where are they disengaged? That's the first thing we need to understand.
So you need to figure out exactly why or where
and
disengaged.
why.
So let's say, I'm just giving examples here, but we have a person coming into, Drew, I'm going to use you as an example. We have a person coming in to do editing. And all of a sudden their work rate slows. They seem to not really care about what they're doing anymore. And it's impacting their work. How would you identify maybe what is causing that?
Well, I would use, there's a technique we developed called MACCIP, which might be useful for you. MACCIP, MACCIP. And it's simply asking the person, look, on a scale of 1 to 10, when you get out of your bed in the morning to come into work here with us, how motivated do you feel? Ask them that question. And then ask them the second question, in terms of being attentive to your needs and the needs of your employer and your team. On a scale of 1 to 10, how attentive do you think you are? Okay. And then you might say, when you go home at night, on a scale of 1 to 10, how creative was your experience today for you? And then you ask them another question on a scale of 1 to 10, how connected did you feel with the work, with the people you are working with? And then you go into the I, how inspired do you feel when you come in here to work with our organisation and our team? Okay, and then finally the P is when you look at your job and you look at your relationship with your work and with us as an organisation, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your potential for personal growth? And the chances are they've never been asked those questions, right? And you'd be amazed when you open that door to that kind of dialogue, what's going to come forth, right? And sometimes you're going to get answers as a leader that you were not prepared for, that actually a lot of the disengagement can come from the way that person's interpreting the leadership style within the organisation, and that's not uncommon. But you need techniques and you need to engage in dialogue and transparency of dialogue.
Yeah, you're right. I do think that anything in life comes down to having a certain toolkit in your mind. And I think that what people don't understand is sometimes when they see the polished, finished article, it's a bit like a swan. You've got this beautiful, graceful swan flowing across the water. Underneath, you just see the legs pedaling. So people need to understand that just because they might see a polished, finished article, it's not always been that way.
Correct.
There has been tough times. For an example, I'll use this podcast as an example. It is quite polished.
Yes.
However, I've had 5 years filming. Drew's had 7 years.
Yes.
7 years.
Yes.
So it's taken a while to get to that level.
Yes.
When managing someone that's disengaged, how do you think you could, once you've identified why they're disengaged, how do you think that you could flick that switch and begin to re-engage them?
Yes, so it starts with a question. Okay, so let's say it was you that was disengaged, hypothetically, right? And your line manager would have to ask you this question. So we've went through the MACCIP, we've went through the dialogue, we understand what's going on and what the dynamics are. And the question is, so Harrison, what has to be different for you in here for you to change?
I need flexible working hours.
Okay. So the question is, am I prepared to make that available to you? Okay. Is there any reason why I can't do that?
And what happens if you do that,
Uh-huh.
but the person remains disengaged?
I think there comes a point in that relationship, and I quite like this saying, and it sounds a bit cold, is give the person the opportunity to change, give them all the tools that they need to change, be fair, provide them with sources of procedural justice, be a reasonable leader, right? But fundamentally, at the end of the day, if that person refuses to change, then change the person.
Okay, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you can pull out all the
Yeah.
stops and have that toolkit available.
Yeah.
But if that person isn't ready to pick the tools up,
Yeah.
then there might need a change in their life.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think it's a form of conscious leadership with compassion, but also with a practical edge and a pragmatic edge. At the end of the day, you're running a business, right? And you've got shareholders. And ironically, the disengaged person is a shareholder in the sense that they have a stake in that business. But fundamentally, if they refuse, see, there's a lovely saying in coaching is that resistance is often a sign of weak rapport, right? So the question is, if this person keeps resisting you, right, in terms of your efforts to connect with them and build an engaged relationship with them, they're resisting you, basically, right? And there comes a point where you run out of resources because they're just too good at resisting you.
Yeah.
They've decided they're going to keep resisting you, then you have to deal with that using the bureaucracy of the personnel department. Yeah.
And you used
God bless the personnel department, incidentally.
You used a really interesting phrase there. You said conscious leadership.
Yeah.
For the viewers and listeners, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, the thing about academia, first of all, I'm a pracademic. All right. So a pracademic is a practically informed academic, right? So I come from a world of practice, but I love theory as well, because I think it was Kurt Lewin once said, there's nothing more practical than a good theory if it helps society do something good within society, right? Okay. So conscious leadership will have multiple definitions depending on which body of literature you go to. So my take on conscious leadership is about leading or attempting to lead or to offer leadership with a sense of heightened conscious awareness about yourself, right? So what I mean by that is this: if I've got John or Sharon who are feeling kind of disengaged and I can't get to the bottom of it with them, right? And they work in my team, conscious leadership is about David saying to himself, okay, when John or Sharon come into my space and I'm with them, what kind of emotional state am I in? How is that emotion affecting my behaviour around them? What are the thinking patterns that are driving the emotional states? And by thinking patterns, I mean, how am I making sense of these two individuals? How am I framing them in terms of their identities? How is that then affecting my emotions, my behavioural strategies, and how is that then affecting their responses to me? So in essence, conscious leadership's about that. It's also about privilege and rapport above everything else when you're dealing with the men and women in your team, creating a leadership service staff culture where rapport becomes a distinctive competency within that culture. It's also about privilege and psychological safety within your culture.
Yeah.
Clearly, it's about privilege and reflexivity in your leadership team, critical reflexivity. And I make a distinction between reflection and reflexivity in my understanding of the terms. So reflection is kind of like, so hey, Harrison, how was your management seminar today? And you'll give me a kind of 2-minute blurb on it, right? And if I say to you, hey, Harrison, can you do me a favour? Can you identify what it was in the management seminar today that in relation to your belief system really worked for you or really didn't work for you? That's reflexivity, because that's inviting you to go into a much deeper structure of your subjective experience. So reflexivity is really important. And the fourth element is, of course, emotional intelligence. As a leader, emotionally, how open am I to the feedback of my colleagues about my leadership style? Can I handle it? So that's what conscious leadership's all about.
Okay, and what? No, it's really interesting. I think you inviting through a question people to dive a little bit deeper into what actually makes them tick.
Yes,
and what it makes people draw out more of them, really.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting. And actually, I've written that down to use in my own management.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we look at conscious leaders, what do you think the traits are for a conscious leader, in terms of, if you were to meet someone on the street and you were to say you're a conscious leader, why do you think that they would be that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think one of the most prominent traits is empathy. Right? Is the ability to take what in NLP terms we call the second perceptual position, to step into another person's shoes and to try and get a feel for how they feel, how they perceive the situation, what their beliefs are, what their values are, what the positive intention is behind their disengagement, right? I think empathy is a key characteristic of conscious leadership. I'd say also, and this sounds really cliched, right? But actually caring about people.
Yeah.
Because I think you can be a leader within, because it's interesting that there is an argument that conscious leadership at some kind of level was born out of the idea of conscious capitalism, which you're probably familiar with. So moving away from the traditional classic view of capitalism, right, to a much softer, fairer, more ethically driven capitalist model. And it looks like your generation is going down that road, for example, where you're wanting to see, there's nothing wrong with making money, right? Everybody, you can make money, but you need to think about how you're going to make money and the impact on wider society through your efforts to make money, right? And how, as a capitalist, when you set up a business, you're going to create a really fulfilling environment for the stakeholders that are going to be engaged with that business. So conscious leadership, I think, comes out of that model. Right, so I do think that you can be compassionate, you can have empathy, you can be quite a caring person, and these are all traits of conscious leadership. But you can also be very pragmatic, and you can also make the tough decisions when you know they need to be made. I don't see any conflict with that.
For sure, and I think what you said about empathy there really resonated.
Yeah,
I think that, let's say you have a member of the team that is slightly, they're behind their target, and for 3 months in a row the trend is that they're not performing. If you have a manager that goes in there and says, why are you behind target, this is a disgrace, you need to get on board, that person is automatically disengaged.
Absolutely.
Whereas if you sat the person down, got them a coffee and said, listen, I'm really worried about you, what is going on, how can I help?
Yes, exactly.
All of a sudden you've totally switched that dynamic. And you genuinely, and it's not out of a place of manipulation. You actually care about that person.
You do, but you also care about your shareholders.
Exactly.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. You care about both. And I think that people can really, especially, and I've experienced it, some managers, especially young managers, fall into the trap of quite aggressive. Whereas that's not the way to get draw out the good in someone. No. The way to draw out the good in someone is to be empathetic.
Correct.
Understand that life's tough.
Yeah, life is tough.
Life's tough, and there's ways of drawing out the good, and I think empathy is a huge part in that.
I think human beings are basically fragile entities, and when we get that through, including the leaders, the reason that some leaders are super aggressive is often that they're occupying what we call disassociated states, right? So they objectify staff as the other, right? When in actual fact they're just as fragile as the staff. That's what's driving those behaviours.
Interesting you said that. Looking at receiving feedback.
Yes.
Especially when I was a bit younger, when I used to receive feedback, I used to get really angry, not at other people, really frustrated, anxious and angry with myself. And I think that in part that's maybe that, what you've just mentioned, it's kind of, I don't know why I reacted that way, but after reflecting on it, it's just because I cared so much.
Yes, exactly.
And I think people that get aggressive, they should channel it into something else. It's just because they care. Aggression isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, it's not. Absolutely not. No.
And they should maybe channel it into a different avenue. If you had a team member that was showing those kind of traits of maybe aggression, maybe passing staff off as the others, as you said, how would you fix that as a leader?
Coaching.
Coaching.
Coaching, yeah. I'd have a mentoring coach. Well, the thing about mentoring is I could offer myself up as a mentor to you, for example, right? But if you don't want me as a mentor, I can't be your mentor, right? And this is one of the flaws in a lot of programs within the workplace, is you're assigned a mentor often, right?
You need to want one.
You need to pick one. It's a very personal thing, a mentoring relationship. And the second thing is, the same thing applies with coaching, right? You have to be open to coaching. The idea that you bring me in and you give me 30 people and you say, right, hey, David, go and coach these people. If they don't really want to be coached, you can't take a horse to water and make it drink, right? So you've got to, first of all, be able to frame this situation. But anyway, going back to the question, I think it's all about dialogue, and it's about how you frame that dialogue with somebody. So I love what you just said a few minutes ago. Okay, David, I'm really concerned about you. It's not like you. You seem to be falling behind on your numbers. And I'm a bit concerned for a number of reasons. And I'm wondering if you would like to share with me why you think you're in this situation just now and what I can do to help you get out of that situation. I think that's an amazing thing to do. And I think that could be often or not very transformative.
And there's a technique that my sister actually showed me that you taught her. What is the technique when you approach someone softly and then you what was it called?
Well, I attended a training program in America over 2 years to become an advanced trainer, behavioral change trainer, and a thing called NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, I beg your pardon. And the lead trainer there is a guy called Robert Dilts. And you've got to give credit to Robert Dilts. He's a phenomenal trainer, educator, and I regard him as an awakener, which is a lovely idea in management, right? But he's brought that idea to the world. Well, Robert introduced me to this thing called giving fish and giving stretch. And this is how it works, right? So let's say you're going to do a presentation to your management team at the business, and you've already shared with me that there could be aspects of the build-up to that presentation and its delivery that you think, I'd like to overcome certain limits and beliefs so I could be a much more powerful, much more effective presenter. Okay, so you do your presentation and I'm in the room, right? But I have to give you feedback. So if I give you feedback like this, hey, Harrison, I really enjoyed your presentation. I could see that you cared very, very much about it, and I admired that. But you've got to realise that you did run over time, and you need to be better at managing your time. And also I felt that some of your slides, they were a bit dense with text, and sometimes people find it difficult, following your narrative when they're looking at all that text. And yeah, I thought you managed your nerves quite well, but you could maybe do a better job of that in future. But, overall, I think you did a grand job. How would you feel?
Probably a little bit better than if it was just straight up negative, I suppose.
Okay.
However, maybe a bit deflated. I don't know. Maybe a bit deflated.
A bit painful. So let's try a different version, shall we? So shake off that state for me, right? Get rid of that memory, okay? So I do this. This is how you give. So that would be the traditional critical feedback, and it's coming from a good place and all the rest of it. Fish and stretch is about this. So if you give someone fish, you say, "So Harrison, really enjoyed the presentation, okay? I could see that you really cared very, very much about it, and that came through in your presentation, and it was quite infectious for me and I think for other people in the room, right? I think what you were really good at today is you are charming, my friend. You leak charm, right? And it's contagious, right? And that's something that we need more of in this organisation. If I was to give you just a little bit of stretch, right, just so that the next time you do it, you can be much more accomplished in your own mind as you go forward for that challenge, is maybe get rid of some of the text, okay? Have more images. Human beings love pictures. You know that. You come from a creative background. And maybe just pace yourself a wee bit more, right? Get into more of a pace. And always remember that people like listening to you, so you don't need to rush it. And so overall, there's my takeaways. Thanks very much for your time.
We need to pause this podcast to bring to you a word from our sponsors. Chisholm Hunter are the sponsors of the Into the Mind podcast, and without Chisholm Hunter, we would not be sitting here today. They have helped support us in a venture that is totally new to them. And I think for a family business that's been around for over 165 years, that's quite incredible. Chisholm Hunter supply luxury jewellery and watches. And all of my jewellery, including this chain, these rings, this watch, are all from Chisholm Hunter. So if you're looking for something for yourself or something for a partner, head to chisholmhunter.co.uk. Back to the podcast.
Okay, so when we think about that technique, right? So if you're delivering fish and stretch combined, if you were to compare how you felt when we invited you to consider the feedback using the fish and stretch techniques, Harrison, how did it make you feel?
So much better. I think I was physically smiling when you were saying it, even though it wasn't real. Yeah, it was so much better.
Yeah. The thing about it is, some people would say, well, it's too soft an approach, right? And in actual fact, I would refute that, right? I think it takes discipline to reprogram your mind as a leader so that you don't use the former model of providing constructive feedback and train your mind to look out for what did the individual do that they can really build on, that I can recognize today, to build on their strengths. And then how can I use that form of feedback to build rapport with Harrison in that moment so that I can then invite him to be open to receiving a little bit of stretch about how he can actually be even better at what he does. And that's the power behind that technique, I feel.
Yeah. I resonate with that totally. I think that if someone genuinely cares about what they're doing as a job, normally you don't need to tell them when they've done something wrong because they know themselves.
Yes, correct.
So when I just introspectively, when I look at the way that Drew and I behind the camera work together, if I do an edit or Drew does an edit, and we always review each other's edits, because two eyes are better than one.
Yes.
And I say, Drew, this is an incredible edit. You've done this right, you've done this right, you've done this right. However, there's a little point here that I'd maybe change. Normally, Drew's already caught that. And he's already, I don't even need to tell him the negatives. Obviously, it's important to develop those aspects that we can. However, normally when you've got a truly engaged person in business, they will see their mistakes and they'll learn from it.
Right.
And it's a very interesting thing. It's a focus on the positives. Don't focus on the negatives.
Yeah, and it's not a new idea. It's been around for quite a long time, It's the idea of focusing on strengths rather than weaknesses is a paradigm that is out there in the world, and it's one that we can all tap into. I also think that people have a natural desire. I'm a big theory why guy, right, in terms of the work of Douglas McGregor, is I believe that people naturally want to do good work. People naturally want to work hard. They naturally want to be part of a tribe, right? They really want to do that. But they can't do good work unless the leadership create a culture that enables them to do good work. If you look at this whole trend behind psychological safety, it's based on a very simple and powerful idea from the literature and from research. I think it was Amy Edmondson's done a lot of work in this area, where that when people feel psychologically safe, they will own their mistakes. You won't need to tell them they made a mistake. They'll say, hey, I've made a mistake. And then they'll learn from those mistakes. But when they don't feel psychologically safe, arguably the opposite occurs. So the key thing for a guy like yourself who's involved in building a business is for the men and women in my team, the professionals in my team, to understand where they could improve without me as a leader having to point it out to them, is based on creating a shared belief system, a shared value system within our own culture that enables that to happen. And the question that I think is really interesting is, can you build such a culture with conscious awareness and intention, or is it something that just accidentally evolves because you're just lucky to have the right type of people around?
It's an interesting question. I don't think, looking at that documentary, I mentioned it to you before, on Joe, the guys that invented really vaping. They didn't invent it, but they made it mainstream. Yeah. They always had their belief system and their mission drilled into everybody. Yeah. And everybody that worked for that company or worked with that company had a shared vision. Yes. And I think that is imperative to any
Absolutely.
business,
Yeah.
because otherwise, why are you there?
Correct.
And I think that looking at the sort of, again, into myself and what we're trying to create,
Yeah.
we've got very specific goals,
Yeah.
and we're trying to create a really, let's take the podcast for an example,
Yeah.
a really relaxed but informational session of talking, and people can really take away a lot.
Yeah.
So I think that, and that's our goal.
Yeah.
And having a clear directive and mission statement, that's the word, mission statement, is so important.
Yeah.
When people aren't engaged, they kind of go the flip way and they're disengaged. Now, you talked in your book about the disengagement epidemic.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, basically, we just need to look at the state the world's in, right? And look at what's been going on in Britain in the last 18 months to 2 years in terms of industrial action across the public sector and the private sector. We've had the National Health Service virtually on its knees. Yes, I know it's been on its knees with COVID, but if you had said to me 3 years ago, hey, David, doctors, nurses, consultants, etc. will be on strike, I wouldn't have believed that, would you?
No, not at all.
I wouldn't have believed it.
Not at all.
You've got the problems across the railways, you've got problems across higher education and further education, problems with the police, and then you've got job insecurity, which is everywhere at the moment. I don't know how you feel about that. Do you think that's a grounded reality?
100%, and
Right.
I think especially amongst, this is just my perspective, I suppose, but from what I can see amongst the council, amongst the NHS, I think that what's happening within the NHS and the council workers is they're being stretched so far, and there's very little empathy, and also they have no leadership, because within the government, without getting political, within the government, they're spending 8 million on the cycling, and they actually removed 3 million away from the Edinburgh Film Festival because they went over budget. As a result, the Edinburgh Film Festival crashed. So all those employees thought, what am I meant to do?
I think from my perspective, when I talk about a disengagement epidemic, I'm talking about something that's on a global scale. When you look at organisations that have, when we look at research, and we quote some of the research in the book, right, but there's tons of research out there, but basically the amount of people that are passively disengaged or actively disengaged is scary, right? The amount of people that have got no idea what the vision or the mission of the organisation is, let alone engage with it, is scary. And if people don't know what your vision is or what your mission is, if they don't feel psychologically safe in that environment, if they're also feeling economically threatened because they don't know if they can put bread on the table in 3 months' time, right? If they're coming into an organisation where they're finding it really difficult to express their ideal version of themselves, then they're going to be pretty disengaged at multiple levels. And I think that what's going to come out of what's going on in the world just now is a rebirth of the way in which leadership culture will actively be formed and developed over time, way beyond my lifetime. But it's going to happen. It has to happen.
Why do you think people, especially in my generation, I can see it, and I think I know roughly the answer, but I'd like your take in this. Why do you think people, especially amongst my generation, are so actively disengaged?
I think I would think that's a really, really good question. There has been research into Generation Y, Generation Z, and we know that based on research that you're looking for greater work-life balance. We know that there is a general view that the money is a means to an end, but the quality of your life beyond work is super important, right, to you. We know it's a more values-driven set of generations in terms of relating to environmentalism and social issues that are really, really important to you. Now, in a way, all of that's not new. Now, I talked about going to California to do my training with Robert Dilts and his colleagues. I mean, Santa Cruz, the Bay Area, San Francisco, birthplace of the hippie movement, right? So if you just go back to the 60s, all right, all young men and women were they really that different to Generation Y and Generation Z today in terms of their liberal attitudes, their interest in the environment, caring about the world? In some ways, you could see they were more proactive. If you look at the demonstrations, let's say, relative to the Vietnam War and things like that, right? So I don't know. maybe it's a rebirth of something that's came before you. Maybe it's a dissatisfaction with the way my generation has led the world that we're leaving behind for you. I think there's a lot going on there. But there's a general dissatisfaction with it, yeah.
I think potentially, and I don't think this is the entire reason, but social media, comparing yourself constantly to something that's not real.
Absolutely.
90% of the time.
Correct.
And I, as a photographer and videographer, I see the fakeness of it.
Yeah.
I see the highlight reel. I can see the edits.
Yeah.
I can see people comparing themselves, and it's terrible because young women and young men are comparing themselves to things that are not attainable.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of it, but
that leads to them being disengaged.
I believe that a lack of purpose leads people to being disengaged.
Yes.
And I think that a business, if done right,
and
if they have a proper goal, can have and give people that purpose.
Yes, which is exactly what conscious leadership is all about.
Exactly. And I think that my advice to people that might feel disengaged or like they've not got a purpose is find something to strive and go towards.
Yes.
For me, when I first started, not within the business, but freelancing, my goal was, right, I'm going to get to, I want to do, these are my bucket shots in terms of photography. You can see them on the wall.
Yes.
I want to get these 5 shots, and if I get those 5 shots, then I can move on to the next 5.
Yes.
And then it led to the next job, and then it led to getting a bigger job with Canon. And progressively, you just step yourself up the ladder. But if people don't start that initial goal, that seems to be the sticking point.
Yes, and also organisations, perhaps there is a lack of knowledge or accessible knowledge of the type of training or workshops that you can provide for young professionals like yourself, so that they can start to really deeply think about what their mission is, or what their vision is, or what their purpose is. Again, going back to the training that I was at in California with Robert Dilts and his team, they introduced us to a technique called the elevator pitch, right? And it's not the traditional version of the elevator pitch. This is a technique that they developed that you can use in a workshop scenario with management teams or of any generation. But it basically works around this idea. I'd say things to you like, okay, in terms of your vision, Harrison, and I'm your manager, right? Okay. Yeah. And this is a different mindset for management. But as a manager, I'd be saying to you, what is your vision? What is it that you want to see more of in the world or less of in the world? What do you want to see more of or less of in the world? And then the second question coming out of that would be, in terms of your work here, how can you, through your work, support the realization of that vision? So you're trying to connect what you're doing on a day-to-day basis within the work with your personal vision of the world. And then they're into questions such as, it's a beautiful technique. You say, okay, so what is your mission, Harrison, in terms of lifetime learning that's going to help you contribute to realizing your vision? And then the next question out of that is, what is your special talent? What do you think you're really, really good at that you can strengthen and further develop that can help you connect with your vision? Now, running these types of workshops starts creating a culture in the organisation that says vision's important, mission's important, purpose is important, talent is important. And then in the elevator pitch, as they developed it at NLPU, they would say things like, so my request from you, David, this is from you to me, is for me to enable my sense of mission, vision, and purpose. Because another question is, what is your purpose? Is in terms of the organisation, what can you do to help me realise these things? And that provides a platform for talent management, right, and vision building, because you want to strengthen the engagement with the company vision, but that it's an old cliche. It needs to be aligned with the individual's sense of vision. And quite often a young person from generation Z or Y may not actually have a well-formed, clear idea of their vision, right? And they mistake vision for ambition. Ambition is different. What do you want to achieve personally through your career? So it comes back to dialogue. And it comes back to knowing the right kind of questions to invite people to think about. And it comes back to having a culture, a leadership culture, that values creating a space within the day-to-day activities of the calendar year for those dialogue workshops, elevator pitch workshops, training, fish and stretch workshops, call it what you like, to take place.
Yeah, that really super helpful what you said there in terms of aligning the team's motives with the company. You know, what is driving them and what is driving the company, and how do they align with each other, instead of this is where the company wants to go. If you're not on it, then you get out. I think that's where it becomes a bit toxic. It's more, listen, what do you want to achieve? Okay, how can you do that with us? How can we help you do that? Through us, say the Into the Mind podcast, whatever it might be. That's super, super important. I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. If you had somebody that's through this disengagement epidemic that we would like to re-engage, and you talked about the sort of methods to do that. Is there a specific technique that you can use as a manager when you're talking to someone to try and gauge why they've dropped off?
Well, the first thing is building and maintaining and sustaining rapport. So you need to break down the acronym rapport, right? So first of all, do I respect you? And do you feel respected? But also, do you respect me? Right? Am I attentive to your needs and to your ambitions and your aspirations? Are you attentive to my needs as a leader? Right? Do we both see the positive aspects of this relationship and the positive intentions behind each other's approach to each other? Right? Do we see the potential of this relationship for you to grow and to move towards your ideal version of you, and also for me to grow as a leader and for this business to grow of ours, right? And am I optimistic about the relationship, which is the O, and can we maintain a strong relational base? And finally, do you trust me as a leader? These elements of the acronym rapport are fundamental to achieving that end state, and then living those elements as a leader and making them fundamental to your conscious leadership mindset is how I think how you go about this. Because let's just play a wee game here, right? If I don't respect you, do we have rapport?
No.
Is there any way you're going to engage with me? Okay, let's take another one out. If you don't see any potential in our relationship, can we have rapport?
No.
If I don't trust you, but do you see where this is going?
No,
so these
sure.
are multi-level critical elements. It's a bit like, you know, making a nice crepe Suzette when I used to be in the catering game, right? If you take out the lemon, it ain't a crepe Suzette. I don't know what it is, but there you go.
Very good. Very good analogy there as well.
Do you like crepe Suzette? Yeah.
Love them.
Love I used to flambe them when I was younger.
Do you think that bigger companies have more trouble implementing those techniques to keep people engaged?
Yeah, massively so. But the question that falls out of that is why?
Why do you think it is?
I think it's the mindset of the senior and middle management teams that they probably don't know these techniques exist, right? B, they're probably trapped in a mindset, a model of a leadership model that they've maybe adopted intuitively through what we call intuitive modeling. Intuitive modeling is, for instance, the way in which we model language as children. If I said to you, where did you learn English?
No idea.
Wow. But you intuitively modeled it from your siblings, from your peers, from your parents, right?
Can intuitively modeling be used on anything in terms of learning?
Yeah, of course it can, yeah. So you've got intuitive and you've got conscious, right? Where, okay, let's go and learn German together.
Okay, so that's
it's
conscious.
A different process, conscious, right? So basically, most people adopt their leadership mindset and behaviours probably intuitively, where they model the leadership culture of their organisation or of their sector.
Okay, so if somebody comes into an organisation, let's say it's a big organisation and they don't have much management style, they're going to intuitively pick up not a very good method of working.
They're going to intuitively carry that into your business.
Wow, that's just blown my mind. So if you were to recruit someone from a different business that, let's say, hasn't got a very good reputation and has disengaged members of team, you would employ them into your team and they would be disengaged when they joined.
They'd struggle to fit into your leadership culture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but the danger with that is we wrote a book, or I wrote a book, I beg your pardon, once called The Butterfly Effect about, and in the butterfly effect, it's based on the metaphor. It's to do with neuro-linguistic programming for change leaders, right? So the principle of the book is this, is that you can affect a leadership culture in an organization simply as one leader in that organization, right? Choosing with conscious awareness to adopt a different leadership style. And there is a possibility by you changing your behavioral states, your thinking states, your emotional states, the way you think about yourself as a leader, if you actually effect genuine follower leadership dynamics, then other people are going to start to model your leadership style.
Right.
Now that works for the positive and the negative. So if you've got somebody who brings a leadership style that, let's say, is a participative leadership style, consultative, maybe a coaching leadership style, maybe a conscious leadership style, then you've hit the jackpot there, haven't you?
Yeah.
You've got an excellent archetype for your business.
Yeah.
But you've got to be able to recognize that in that person.
Yeah.
And the problem is, do they recognize it as a general rule? And I don't think they do. And then because it's a lack of education. The second thing is, if you get someone who has an anti-conscious leadership mindset, right? So they don't give fish and stretch. They're not open to leadership development. They use hierarchy and command and control. It's management by exception. They're getting involved in what you do when there's a problem. They're not interested in building rapport. You're just a resource. That's an extreme version. But how uncommon is that?
I think it's more common than the other.
Right?
The other.
So based on anecdotal evidence from friend, family, peers, it doesn't appear to be that uncommon. Now, if you don't recognise what that is, then that's the rotten apple in the barrel, right? So we know what one rotten apple can do to 1,000 apples in a barrel.
Yeah, and that's exactly the next question I was going to ask is, what is your opinion on leadership when it comes to, I'm going to try and use the most PC term here, cults, or let's say Donald Trump, because people are following
Donald Trump.
Well, people are. I don't really understand it. People are following. If it's Donald Trump, we're talking about.
I'll talk about Donald Trump.
He's probably going to jail. Why do you think people are following him?
Okay, so I often find with managers that I'm dealing with, or even students of management, but say we're working with MBA students who tend to be, had a few more years in management, so to speak, is that people are curious about why someone like Donald Trump appears to have the influence and support that he appears to have. And usually they're not actually that curious about why they have the support. The curiosity is more of a critique, a kind of like turning up your nose or holding your nose, like they don't like him. Right? It's more about a judgmental mindset than an openness to understand, right? And so what we say is, in response to that, as a trainer, for example, I would say to him, look, what you should really be doing here, right, is not judging the guy, right, but looking at him and asking yourself a question. How is it that this individual became the leader within the most competitive industry in America, which is the real estate industry, and became massively successful and got to the very pinnacle of that industry, and then flipped and moved into the media and ended up with one of the top selling shows in the world and became a very, very senior producer and executive within that industry, and then flipped it again and got to the very top of politics and became the most powerful person in the world. 3 different industries, and he's climbed to the top of all 3 of them. So the answer to that question is he's doing something, because it's not an accident, right? And if you really want to understand leadership, you need to understand how he's doing it. But if you're critical of him because you don't like the cut of the man's clothes, then that's going to get in the way of you really understanding how he's doing it. And that's what's important.
Yeah, I agree to an extent. I think that Donald Trump inherited roughly what his net worth is today.
Did he?
So a lot of his net worth, I know that he's saying he's a billionaire.
Yeah.
He's going to court and he's probably going to go to jail.
Probably.
Because he's not. I think that what he did with the media is he said the things that nobody else would say.
Correct.
And I think that got him so much public scrutiny, but also a lot of people agree. Yeah.
Because he was pacing a certain group within America. So pacing is a classic salesman's technique, right? So it's where I align myself with your beliefs, your values, your subjective views of the world. I don't necessarily have to agree with them, but I project them back onto you. So he was pacing a critical block of voters. I mean, the reason he got voted into power is because the majority of Americans saw that man as a leader.
I think but the interesting thing about him is that most politicians are so grey. There's no black and whites. There's no right or wrongs.
Yeah.
It's maybe.
Yeah.
Whereas he came along, and I remember he was interviewed about the war that was going on in Ukraine and Russia, and he stopped the interviewer and he said, "I want to stop people dying. I do not care about anything else."
Yeah.
And nobody else would have said that bar him.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of people can get on board with that because it's not that the Russians are bad, it's that the Russians are being told to do something. And it's not that Ukrainians are bad, they're being told to do something.
And also from your own background, you would recognise that he was probably a pioneer as a politician in using social media. I mean, what he did with Twitter was unbelievable. And I just want to put a caveat in this podcast, right? This is super important to me, all right? I don't necessarily admire this character, right? Yeah. And I don't necessarily think that he's a force for good in the world, right? What I do recognise, though, is that the ability to influence people is what leadership is all about.
Yeah.
And he has that ability. There is no question about that. So the question is, and I haven't studied him enough, how is he doing it? And we should be studying that.
Do you think that he's maybe, and you've not studied him, but...
Not enough, no.
Do you think that it's maybe because he's so polarising that people kind of respect that he's so open?
Well, if you take the word polarised for a minute here, right, you could say polarising has a negative context to it, right? But he can only have a polarised block of support if the people relate to what he's saying, right? Yeah. He's able to influence them because he's playing out a narrative that they're playing out every day in their houses. That's what he's doing. If you go back to, not to do a comparison with Donald Trump, but if you go back to Adolf Hitler, it was the same thing. He got to power in Germany because a critical mass of the German people at that time identified with his narrative. And he knew that, right? And I think what Donald Trump was doing is something that politicians always thought they were always good at. But what I think the rest of them have lost is they've lost that frank candidness to say it how they see it, right? Regardless of how it's going to land. And I think that Donald Trump has tapped into a technique or a strategy for influencing that the others are just not up to speed on.
Yeah. He's an interesting figure. He's definitely maybe polarizing isn't the right word. However, he's a controversial.
I think it is the right word. My view of it is the right word. But polarizing does mean, I think, when you mean by it, it's putting people into two different camps. Yes. Yeah, but they are already in two different camps. Yeah, that's his reality. Yeah. What he's done, he's recognised that, broadly speaking, in his country, it's split. There are two different camps. There's two different versions of America in the mindsets of two polarised groups, I think.
Yeah, in terms of leadership, when we're on the topic of leadership and getting to presidency and all this kind of stuff, when somebody's younger and they're let's say they're an entrepreneur or they're within business or management, what do you think are the mistakes that they make when leading a team?
If I could go back in a time machine and visit my 24-year-old self, and if you were my boss, knowing what I know now, I'd say, please put me on a coaching program.
Really?
Yeah, put me on a coaching program. Let me learn to be a coach within your business, and that you can be much more confident that you're going to have a very engaged asset on your hands, and also a much more effective team leader and someone who's perfectly capable of taking a part of your business through time and become an executive leader. Get them when they're young.
Yeah.
Get them when they're impressionable, but also keen to learn, and let them see this other body of knowledge and techniques that they can use within the workplace. That's how I'd answer that question.
That's a brilliant take, because I've actually heard, and I can't remember where I've heard it, but I don't take credit for it at all. Somebody asked someone very successful, how do you succeed in your business at such a young age? And he went, well, it's quite easy. There's older people that have done all the work for me.
Yeah.
I just hire them for a few days and learn.
Wow.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And it was so, it hit home to me. I thought, I'm struggling with marketing. Why don't I talk to somebody that's done it before?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think people of my generation, right, if I was to go back into management as an occupation, then, and if you said to me, what's the ideal role for you, David, within our team? I wouldn't want to be your MD. I wouldn't want that, right? I wouldn't want to be a chief exec. I wouldn't want to be a director. I'd like to be a mentor to your management talent. I'd like to be their awakener, their guide, their trainer, their heading up your coaching division. I think that older, more mature heads have got a hell of a lot to offer in that dynamic, and that actually fits really nicely with a lot of Indigenous cultures, where the older warriors or the older practitioners then become teachers and guides and awakeners and mentors. And I think we'd like to see more of that. I think there's a massive tranche of the labour market out there today that, if it was redirected into that type of work, could be awesome.
Yeah.
And allow Generation X and Generation Y to take a grip of the world.
Yeah. And I think from speaking to you, you definitely are that awakener that you're talking about. I think that from the conversation we've had so far, you do allow a deeper level of thinking within business and within leadership. And I think that thinking on, again, from my point of view, you're so right in terms of the older heads have so much to offer in their specific area.
Yeah.
But I think what people need to remember is that times do change.
Correct.
And for example, let's say you have a CEO of a business that's 75 years old, brilliant brain, and they were amazing at selling. They'll be the master at selling.
Yeah.
However, they might not understand social media marketing because it's a young man's game.
Correct.
So it's finding the right person.
It's finding the right person. You have to have, so you need a transition, right? So that, again, it's all about, if you take someone who's in their 50s, and I'm not being ageist here, but let's say somebody in their 50s, and they're moving towards, in their minds, maybe slowing down, maybe looking towards some form of semi-retirement or retirement, right? The question is, how do you, if you want to keep them on in kind of mentoring, coaching type roles, right? Even on a freelance basis, you might have a freelance contract with them, reinvent the idea of the work relationship with them. How do you prepare them for that role? And you still have to think about the characteristics of a conscious leadership mindset and say, do they have that, or do they have the foundations of being open to grabbing it? And you need to have that filtering process.
There was a quote that I heard from Stephen Bartlett, who runs his own podcast. We both listen to his podcast.
It's very cool.
And he said, what I often ask CEOs and managers is, are you driven or are you dragged? Yeah. And what he meant by that was, is there a shadow that you're running away from? Yeah. Or something traumatic in your past that's happened? Yeah. And you're dragging yourself to be successful? Yeah. Or are you genuinely motivated to achieve this thing? Yeah. He's into deep psychology there, isn't he? And I think that's a really interesting question, and I was wondering what your kind of take on it was. Well, I think our antecedents, our history, our previous timelines shape who we are today. I'm quite big on that. Therefore, I recognise that my leadership style. I'll give you an interesting example, right? I find it interesting, right? Is I used to have quite a strong leadership style, probably fairly uncompromising, right? Very quick to be an advocate for a point of view. Quite a decisive character when I was in leadership, right? Very strong on quality, right?
quite rigorous in terms of expectations. Flip side, also kind of compassionate, right? Kind of caring, super optimistic about how people could grow and develop. But the two sides didn't seem to be compatible at times, right? So I was on a coaching program once, and they said, how would you describe your leadership style, David? So I described it like that, and they said, where do you think that came from? And I said, what do you mean? Where did it come from? And they said, well, if you were to go back down your timeline, at which point in your life do you think you first adopted that leadership mindset, those qualities? And I realised that I was modelling my dad, that my leadership style was my father. Everything I admired in him and saw in him, I had inculcated into me. And then what I was doing is my expectancy in other leaders was that.
Yeah.
And if you had a different leadership style to that, then I was quite critical, which made me quite difficult to get along with.
Yeah.
Because people sensed I was judging them. And that coaching day transformed my life, because I realised that that leadership style was great for him and his generation. Remember the world he came from, right? But I didn't need to be like that. And that gave me a lot more what we call in coaching behavioural flexibility. I realised that I could adopt different types of leadership styles. I just needed different role models.
That's opened my eyes a little bit, just thinking about, especially when I was a little bit younger, how my management style used to be. It was very reflective of what I was taught by my dad. And I think that I definitely took his traits and adopted them for mine.
Yeah.
I don't think maybe that's the case anymore, but the only reason that it's maybe not the case anymore is that I'm in a field that he doesn't really understand.
Yeah.
So I kind of need to make my own way. Yeah. Because I can't be guided.
Yeah.
That's kind of blown my mind, that actually.
Yeah. It's interesting. So, you know, the thing, going back to your question about mentoring, I think it's really interesting if you take a more established manager, reached a stage in their life where they're looking for maybe an exit, but they could be of value to your business as a mentor trainer type thing. And I saw a quote on LinkedIn. I can't remember for the love of me the author, but it was something like this: watch out the kind of mentors that you get, right? There are some mentors who see it as an opportunity to inculcate other people with the leadership mindset that has served them throughout their lives. That's not a mentor, right? That's a very selfish thing to do. A mentor has to be a genuine curiosity and a genuine desire to help somebody become a version of themselves that could be quite different to your leadership style, but what works for them works for the team and works for the organization. The mentoring is about sharing experiences that can help that person as a resource, not about programming them to be a version of you. And I believe that.
And that's transformational leadership.
That's transformational.
So when we get to transactional leadership versus transformational.
Yeah.
Firstly, for the people maybe listening, what do you think the specific differences are, and how would you go away from transactional and begin being more transformational? Right.
So I've thought about this for a long time. Okay. First of all, transactional leadership, transformational leadership have been around for a good few decades, right? Okay, as models. So the first thing is transactional leadership is that if you go back to something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? What do we need, right? We need a shelter, we need food, we need provisions, we need resources, so we need cash, right? So we need to go to work, right? So when I turn up at work, let's say at the business school, and they ask me to deliver a training course or something, or where I was yesterday, I mean, as Tony Robbins says, I don't do it because I have to do it. I do it because I get the chance to do it, right? It really turns me on and I like it, right? Yeah. The flip side to that, of course, is I believe I'm well paid for doing it as well, right? Would I go and do it for nothing? I would probably do it pro bono within the community if there was the right opportunity. I would do that for nothing, and my reward is engaging with a purpose or a commitment to something that I think is really worthwhile. But generally speaking, most people don't sell their labour for nothing, right? So you sell your labour for a price. So the transactional element, I pay you a wage or you pay me a wage. You give me a company car, you maybe give me share dividends, depending on what I'm involved in. And in return, you give me sick pay, you give me holiday pay, you give me maternity pay and all the rest of it. And in return for that, you expect me to follow your guidance and to accept your instructions within cultural normality and be a good employee. Am I right?
Yeah.
Well, that's the fundamental basis of the leadership relationship. So if you say that leadership is about influence, there's the basis of all influence within the workplace. Would you go along with that?
Yeah.
So transactional leadership isn't a bad thing. However, if it's a transactional leadership base and there's no real rapport, there's a lack of psychological safety, that people don't feel that you have an interest in their growth or their development, they're just a means to an end, then you could call that an impoverished transactional leadership culture. Impoverished in the sense that it's lacking rapport. When you get that type of culture in your organisation, you've potentially got a big problem, right? If you have a transactional base where people think they're getting fairly well paid, and here's the interesting thing about being fairly well paid, if you're getting paid enough, you don't think about it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's when you're not getting paid enough, you become aware of it, right? So if you're getting paid enough relative to your peers, relative to your occupation, then that should be fine, right? If you've got security of employment, that's a big help, right? But then if you've got a boss like Harrison, who has a kind of conscious leadership style, coaching style, leadership style, and really wants to build rapport with you and everything else that we've been talking about today, then you have an enriching transactional leadership culture. Now, when the organisation is just sort of jogging along, right, and everything's been fairly good in the past and it's kind of just jogging along in the present towards its future, we know that that's a perfectly reasonable leadership culture to have. You're going to achieve expectations, right? Expected outcomes are going to come in. But if you suddenly find yourself in a wind tunnel of change, right, okay, where your business idea and your business culture has been really tested and the future is really, really becoming progressively uncertain, then that leadership culture is not enough. You then need to accelerate up into the world of transformational leadership. And the model that Bassanavoglio developed in 1990, which everybody, leadership theorists would be familiar with, is called the additive effect, right? And it's a lovely model, and this is based on the 4 I's, right? Yeah. So what he says is transformational leadership must have a foundation of good quality transactional leadership, an enriching base. But you need people in your organisation that are sources of leadership, of sources of motivation at a higher level. So either, if I remember correctly, inspirational motivation. And what I think they mean by that, is one of the I's, is the manager's manager, the soldier's soldier, the podcaster's podcaster. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Raymond Bartlett's of the world, right?
Yeah.
So who do you see as your role model? Inspirational motivation. So that means within your occupational culture, you need leaders that are representing the very best in their class to be role models if they're going to inspire people. Then you might have intellectual stimulation, right? So business schools, for example, do you have leaders in the business school that intellectually inspire you to go to greater lengths of research or engagement? Or if you work at Bayer, right, are you employing PhD researchers who are inspired intellectually by their executive leaders to do great things in the world? Then the other one is idealized influence, which is actually, I've kind of flipped that. Idealized influence is more of the role model. Inspirational leadership, I got them around the wrong way, I do apologise. Right. Inspirational leadership is to do with your backstory. So if you take someone like Barack Obama, right? Barack Obama's backstory with his mum and his dad coming from a fairly poor background, etc. It's a really inspiring story. If you take someone like Oprah Winfrey, it's a really inspiring story. Steve Jobs, it is an inspiring story. It's like they have went through their own hero's journey. Yeah. So that can be a source of inspiration for you. Even Stephen Bartlett's story, it's utterly inspiring, right? And then the last one, and I'll get this one right, it's individualized consideration. Do you feel that your leaders care about you? Do they have your best interests at heart? So what these scholars are saying is that these sources of inspiration have to be available in parts, or do you know what I mean? If you want to inspire people to go beyond expectations, to really stretch themselves, and to help your organization make that leap into something very different in the future. Yeah. And that's a long-winded answer, but that's the answer.
No, it makes sense, and I think that I'm going to be dissecting that when I go through this podcast for sure, even in more detail, because I think that it is such a good thing to strive towards.
Yeah.
And also to understand, what management style do I have right now? Is it inspirational, or just what type is it? And maneuvering that into what you want it to be.
I think you're doing the right thing. If you take individualized consideration, I mean, how difficult would it be for you to tap into your natural identity as a carer?
I think it'd be quite easy for me.
Yeah, so do I. That's why I'm asking the question, right? So you've already got that internal identity and that natural inclination to caring about people, right? Which can be balanced with a pragmatic edge as a manager and a leader, right? So you take the acronym of rapport and take the 4 elements of the conscious leadership framework that we adopt, and with purpose awareness, seek to maintain psychological safety in your teams, to build respect, attentiveness, potential, trust, respect. And if you do that, then the likelihood is that the men and women that work for you are going to respond in a very favourable and productive way. So therefore, post facto, you're providing a source of individualised consideration, which is one of the key elements of a transformational leadership mix.
Let's say you're in a management role and you're disengaged. You're not quite actively disengaged, but you're listening to this and thinking, I don't really like what I'm doing, and my team aren't following me for some reason, whatever reason it is, they don't respect me. How would you begin? What's the kind of advice that you could give to begin that flip of going from a disengaged leader, a manager, to beginning to back to an engaged leader, which your team are following?
I think it's a really hard thing to do. If people lose respect for you for some reason, it's really difficult to get that back, assuming that you even had it. It's difficult to do it. However, if you have a commitment from the management team that the management team wants to change your culture because they feel that the staff don't respect the existing leadership style, and if you're prepared to go through a transformational journey as a group to adopt a different model of leadership style, then you have some chance of flipping disrespect into respect, right? However, it's a tough journey. It's a tough journey.
It takes years.
Yeah, it can take years, but you've got to ask yourself, how many years do you want your business to be alive for? Right? Do you want a business that's going to be generating shareholder wealth for your grandchildren? Do you want a business that's going to be sustaining employment within the community for another 30 or 40 years? So what's 3 years? Investing in your leadership culture to create a different leadership archetype, which can create a more engaged workforce. So when you say it takes years, but relative to the bigger picture, it's nothing.
How would someone lose respect in a management role? Do you think that not having the nous to call out somebody when they've done something wrong in a building way is maybe where that lack of respect comes in? Because you're allowing people to get away with something that maybe they shouldn't be getting away with.
Yeah, I don't think... Let's go back to conscious leadership for a minute, right? I think you can adopt a conscious leadership model and mindset and behavioural state and still confront poor performance. but you confront it with the techniques that we explored earlier on in the podcast. In fact, you articulated it to me. I mean, I was sitting listening to you thinking, wow, I need to be able to say it that way in one of my training programs, you know. So this idea of calling them out, but doing it in a nice way and saying, look, you know, you and I both know it's not working. It's not good enough. And I'm really curious to try and understand why we're in this situation. And I'm really interested in understanding your perspective. As you pointed out earlier, I think you'd be amazed the effect that can have on people. So if, however, you're not challenged, because that is a challenge.
It's
just a different way of doing it, right? Right? If, however, the real issue is that your managers don't feel psychologically safe themselves in making the challenge, they lack the confidence, well, that's a different training need.
So what happens if your manager is, let's say, conflict averse and can't physically bring themselves to call out on something that is done wrong?
So there's a lovely saying in coaching that people are not their behaviours. I love that, right? And what that basically means is that our behaviours are projections of our thoughts, of our beliefs, and of our values. So they're social constructions, right? And usually we've learnt them from somewhere. And I used to, I did some research once with an organisation that prided itself on the fact that it didn't get involved in confrontation with staff. And actually the hallmark of being a really good manager was somebody who got along well with everybody. And conversely, what that also developed was a challenge in challenging poor performance. Because if you engaged in that type of interpersonnel dynamics, there was a danger that you might be labelled as not being an effective manager, right? So we can borrow from anthropology to understand it. So rather than just looking at the individual, the case that you're talking about, you could ask yourself a question: how shared is that attitude throughout this organisation? How common is it? Right? Now, if it's an isolated case, it's just one person, the chances are that maybe their upbringing or their previous work experience, if they came from another organisation, has taught them to behave that way. But the chances are it could be broader than just the individual. And when I was doing my PhD, I looked at the work of an anthropologist called Morris Opler, who did a lot of work with the Native Americans. I think it was the Chiricahua Apache, if I remember correctly. And he came out with this idea of cultural theme analysis, which I don't know if it was Morris's idea or he picked it up from previous anthropologists, but it's a brilliant idea. And then a cultural theme is defined, if I can recall it correctly, as I think it's a postulate or a position or an attitude that's implicitly or explicitly advanced within a cultural group. That's a lot to remember, right? Okay, right. But basically what it means is that it could be that conflict avoidance is somehow or other culturally normative within the broader culture of the organisation. And if that is the case, then what you've got in your hands is a systematic change, a cultural change, where you're going to have to get the senior management team to sit and say, right, we need to understand through research how ingrained this actually is in our culture, and also to say to ourselves, you know, what is the positive intention behind that cultural theme? What benefit have we had from it in the past? Do we get any benefit from it just now? And if not, and where we're going in the future, what type of performance management culture are we really trying to develop here? These are bigger questions. So that's how I would respond to that.
Do you think it would come from above? So let's say... Yeah, it always comes from above.
Absolutely. Fish rots from the head, my friend.
Oh, that's a great saying.
I think that came for the Sicilians.
That's a great saying. Fish rots from the head. That is phenomenal. I'm going to use that.
So at the end of the day, I'm a big believer in this. You can take your PhDs, your MBAs, your lifetime in management, distill it all down. It comes to this. If you want to change a leadership culture or a service culture, the leaders in that organisation have to be role models for that change. As Gandhi said, and I'm paraphrasing Gandhi here, you know, to be the change you want to see in the world. I mean, that's what this is all about. One of the biggest flaws in cultural change projects when it comes to leadership or service standards or leadership standards or team working standards is Do the managers in the organisation walk the talk and walk? Are they models, and are they day-to-day archetypes for the culture that you want to see in your business?
That's fascinating. And on a sort of closing note, I don't want to close, but I think we'll have to because you'll need to get home. But you mentioned before emotional contagions.
Yeah.
And I was very sort of invested in that idea. Can you explain that to
Are
people?
you a football fan?
More rugby.
Oh, you're a rugby fan. Well, that's good. That's good. So, obviously, I'm assuming it's Scotland.
Yes.
All right. Do you like going to? Do you ever go to Glasgow Warriors?
I've been once or twice.
Have you ever been to Ulster versus Glasgow?
I've not.
Oh, you should. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever noticed the way? Have you ever? Here's a good example. Do you love watching the Hacker?
Yeah.
Right. I love the Hacker. I use the video of the Hacker in my training programs. Right. Because they are exemplars of emotional contagions. So as you know, the Haka is a ritual dance, if you like, that Maori people from New Zealand, I think they're Maori from New Zealand, are inculcated into from children. And the idea is to create an emotional state in the team, let's call it a warrior state, that prepares them to go into battle and win that rugby match. And we'll see if they win the World Cup, right?
I think they will.
I think they might as well, right? You know, England's got a tough job with, I think is it South Africa?
Yeah.
Right. So basically an emotional contagion is this. It's a group of people catching the emotional states of each other, so they all become at one in their emotional state. And then you'll notice with a Hacker something amazing happens in the audience and the spectators. They start capturing the energy and they start playing back the energy to the All Blacks as players. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
And then that just creates this fantastic field of energy, emotional energy, that enables them to go and do their stuff. So let's just bring it back to the land of day-to-day management, right?
Yeah.
If I'm your manager, I'm your lineman, I'm your leader, supposed to be. And this is the interesting thing about managers. Managers are expected to provide leadership, but they often don't, right? So, and we're going to have a team meeting about a change program. And I come into the meeting and I'm late and I'm looking flustered and I'm a bit agitated. And I don't have control of my papers. How do you start feeling? Anxious. So you start catching it, don't you? Okay. Let's take a different side of it. So we come in the morning and I come in and I say, hi everybody, how you all doing? And I take my time, take my jacket off, loosen my tie, go and make myself a cup of coffee. So you don't mind if I just make a wee coffee? And then I sit down, I lean back and say, so what are we going to talk about? How do you feel?
Very relaxed.
Right. Okay. Now I've seen the two different sides of leadership presence, management presence, emotional contagions. I think Elaine Hatfield's done a lot of work in this area. It's such a powerful idea because it can make or break a business.
And as you said, fish rots from the head.
Fish rots from the head.
So it all comes from above.
It all comes from good and bad.
So if you have, let's say, a regional manager, let's say above the manager is a regional manager that comes into meetings flustered, doesn't really know what he was going to talk about, clearly hasn't prepared. That then trickles down into your management and into your teams below.
Also, what that individual is doing is sending out a signal that it's okay to be in this state. This is normal.
That's interesting.
And therefore other people adopt it. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. We can all miss our bus. The car can break down. You know, the guy or the girl probably has a real positive intention. They don't want to let the team down. There's always background circumstance. But if that type of thing becomes culturally almost like part of the cultural DNA of the business, where people go into a kind of crash state, borrowing from the world of NLP again, where they're kind of contracted, emotionally reactive, they're hurting, maybe feeling separate from people, and all this emotional energy is just leaking out of them. That can't be good for the leadership culture.
No, not at all.
No.
Not at all. And I think, David, just on a final note, you used the word awakening,
an
awakener.
Love that word. And
I think that you yourself are, in terms of cultural change and leadership, are an awakener.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you so much for coming on. It's been, honestly, I would love to sit here for hours just picking your brain, but it's been amazing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll share something with you. My purpose as a trainer and as an educator is to be an awakener. So I'm really really blessed with that validation. And going back to your sister, my job in that classroom was to awaken in her and the other students in that room that absolutely anything is possible for them. So if they can see it, they can be it, to borrow from Arnold.
No. And I see it in you. No, I've been serious, because one of the first things, and I think this is very prevalent amongst brilliant leaders, and I saw it in Grant Wilson, who we did a podcast with, CEO of IWC Watches. Instead of just talking about what was, say we were doing a podcast, Grant's first response was, what do you want to achieve from the podcast? It wasn't, what am I going to achieve? And you said exactly the same thing. And it's that flip that makes a really great leader. It's what do you want to achieve, and how do our values align?
Yeah.
And it comes back to what we started with in the podcast.
Yeah.
And I think that is you to a T. So honestly, thank you so much for coming on.
No, welcome, man. Thank you. And the bald man over there.